The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but peace brought little relief to millions trapped in the ruins. Across Germany, Austria, and much of Eastern Europe, entire cities lay in rubble, transportation networks were shattered, and food production had collapsed. Fields that once provided bread for the continent were either battlefields cratered by artillery or left fallow because the men who worked them were dead or imprisoned. In Japan, the devastation was even worse. Strategic bombing had incinerated 60 major cities. By the summer of 1945, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and countless smaller towns were seas of ashes. The atomic bombs had annihilated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In both Germany and Japan, famine was no longer a fear for the future. It was already reality. For civilians, survival meant desperate measures. In Berlin, mothers sent children out to dig for potatoes in frozen fields, often stealing from military dumps guarded by Allied troops. In Tokyo, elderly men scavenged through blackened ruins, stripping charred beams from destroyed houses to barter for rice. In Hamburg, Cologne, and Frankfurt, women pushed wheelbarrows through collapsed streets, searching for anything edible. In Nuremberg, children gathered weeds from ditches and boiled them for soup. For years, Nazi and Imperial Japanese propaganda had insisted that America was a cruel enemy, one that would enslave and starve defeated peoples once victory was won. In 1945, many Germans and Japanese believed this would come true. But the first encounters with American soldiers told a different story. When American GIs entered shattered towns, they saw not just defeated enemies, but starving civilians. They began sharing their own rations. Soldiers gave chocolate bars and chewing gum to children who had never tasted them before. Sea rations of Spam, crackers, and powdered eggs were quietly slipped to families hiding in cellars. In one famous photograph from Cologne, a young German boy smiles shyly as an American paratrooper kneels to hand him a Hershey bar. In Tokyo, Marines arriving after the surrender offered tinned meat and cigarettes to civilians who had expected humiliation. The gesture was small, but to hungry men and women who had been told to expect cruelty, it was shocking. The enemy fed them. Yet the scale of the crisis went far beyond what soldiers' kindness could address. In 1945, estimates suggested that more than 20 million Germans were at risk of starvation. In Japan, the rice harvest had been cut nearly in half, leaving over 10 million at risk. Entire populations depended on decisions made in Washington and by commanders on the ground. Would the United States choose vengeance, or would it choose mercy? Many expected vengeance. After all, memories of Pearl Harbor and Bataan, of Auschwitz and Dachau, of U-boat sinkings and kamikaze attacks were still raw. American soldiers had suffered and died in unimaginable numbers. But the decision President Harry Truman and General Dwight Eisenhower made was extraordinary. The United States would feed its enemies. That decision did not come easily. There were voices demanding harsh retribution. In 1944, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau had proposed a plan to dismantle German industry and reduce the nation to a pastoral society, ensuring it could never wage war again. Food shipments, under such a plan, would be limited to prevent economic recovery. Similar proposals existed for Japan, envisioning an impoverished island nation left crippled for decades. But other voices argued that starvation would not bring peace, only bitterness and eventual revenge. General Eisenhower, who had walked through the horror of the liberated concentration camps, knew what mass hunger would mean. In July 1945, he wrote, "We cannot feed Europe in anger. If we do, the consequences will be another war." So the United States chose the path of generosity. Beginning that summer, ships began arriving in Europe and Asia carrying wheat, flour, powdered milk, dried beans, canned meat, and medical supplies. Between July 1945 and December 1946, American shipments delivered more than 16 million tons of food and goods across Europe and Japan. The sheer scale was staggering. In Hamburg, warehouses filled with sacks of American flour were guarded by MPs to prevent desperate mobs from looting. In Yokohama, longshoremen unloaded cases of condensed milk, stacked beside Japanese civilians waiting in line with empty tin cans. For many, this was the first real meal they had eaten in months. The memory of hunger in those first post-war winters was seared into survivors. A German woman from Frankfurt later recalled, "I was 13 years old in 1946. My mother would boil water with a handful of barley, and that was our dinner. Then one day, American trucks came, and they gave us white bread. I had never seen white bread before. We ate it slowly, afraid it might be a dream." In Japan, a boy named Hiroshi Takahashi remembers that the first time he tasted peanut butter from an American relief package. "It was strange and salty and sweet. I did not know what it was, but I will never forget it. To us, it meant life." What made this act of generosity even more remarkable was that Americans themselves were weary of war and rationing. The US had just endured 4 years of food restrictions. Sugar, meat, butter, and gasoline had all been tightly rationed for the war effort. Victory had only just lifted these burdens, yet the government asked Americans to continue conserving so that food could be shipped overseas. "Don't waste bread, it's needed for Europe," posters declared. Housewives were encouraged to stretch meals, while farmers increased production beyond wartime levels. The generosity of the American people, already strained, extended across oceans to feed former enemies. For US soldiers still stationed in occupied zones, the contrast between recent battle and immediate relief was surreal. Captain Henry Wilson, serving in Bavaria, wrote to his wife in 1946, "Just last year we were fighting these people, and now I watch my men giving candy to their children. I thought I'd feel bitterness, but instead I feel relief. Maybe this is the best way to make sure my son never has to fight here again." In Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the distribution of food aid with the same meticulous attention he had once devoted to planning invasions. He understood that rebuilding Japan began not with factories, but with full stomachs. By the end of 1945, something remarkable was happening. Where many expected vengeance and suffering, there was instead a fragile but growing sense of gratitude. Germans who had mocked the Americans during the war began to admit a grudging respect. Japanese civilians, who had been told Americans would treat them as slaves, were stunned to see aid workers teaching children how to mix powdered milk. Rumors spread quickly. America, the nation that had destroyed their cities, was now determined to save lives. But winter was only beginning. The worst hunger was still ahead. In both Germany and Japan, the harvests of 1946 would fail catastrophically, leaving millions again on the brink. The generosity shown so far was just the beginning. America's decision to continue relief on an even greater scale would not just feed stomachs, it would feed hope. It would transform enemies into allies, creating a foundation for peace that weapons alone could never secure. By early 1946, the full magnitude of the post-war food crisis had become impossible to ignore. The war had left the farmlands of Europe and Asia shattered, and no nation felt this collapse more acutely than the defeated Axis powers. Germany's farmland had been bombed, burned, or simply left untended while men fought on distant fronts. Japan's rice harvest had been cut by nearly half, and coastal fishing fleets lay rusting in harbors destroyed by bombing. The crisis threatened not just hunger, but outright famine on a scale unseen in modern history. At stake was more than survival. Would the defeated peoples, humiliated and starving, turn to bitterness and extremism? Or would mercy win them over to a new vision of peace? American leaders understood that the answer to that question lay in bread, not bullets. In February 1946, President Harry Truman told Congress, "We must not allow the world to plunge into famine, starvation, and is the seedbed of chaos. To secure peace, we must first secure food." The statement set the tone for what would become one of the most remarkable humanitarian efforts of the 20th century, the feeding of America's former enemies. In Germany, the daily ration allowed to civilians was a meager 1,000 calories, less than half the requirement for survival in winter. A German doctor in Munich recorded that his patients wasted away to skin and bone, their teeth falling out from malnutrition. The black market thrived. Cigarettes became currency. Families sold furniture, heirlooms, even wedding rings for a sack of potatoes. In one diary entry, a German mother wrote, "My little boy cries at night. He says his stomach hurts. I have nothing to give him. When I hear the trucks, I pray they are American." The trucks did come. Beginning in March 1946, the U.S. Army and civilian relief agencies launched Operation Vittles. Shipments of flour, powdered milk, dried peas, and canned meat distributed through local councils. At depots across Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and Hamburg, long lines of civilians gathered, clutching ration cards. American soldiers supervised distribution, often assisted by German women who had been widowed by the war. The irony was bitter. The widows of men who had fought and died against America were now helping deliver food supplied by the very nation their husbands had fought to destroy. Yet for many, gratitude overcame bitterness. Children felt the relief most acutely. They were the first to benefit from the shipments of powdered milk and vitamin-rich biscuits. In Stuttgart, American doctors set up feeding stations where underweight children received daily meals of hot soup. A German girl, 7 years old, later wrote in her school essay, "The soldiers gave us soup. It was yellow and warm. I was not hungry for the first time. I think of them when I say my prayers." The generosity extended beyond Germany. In Japan, General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, recognized that famine threatened to destabilize the fragile occupation. He ordered emergency shipments of American rice and wheat. In Yokohama, enormous warehouses filled with white sacks stamped USA became symbols of survival. Thousands of Japanese civilians, many still wearing ragged kimonos scorched by firebombing, queued patiently for their share. Some bowed deeply before American officers, an expression of gratitude unthinkable during the years of war. For Japanese schoolchildren, the relief came in the form of lunches made from powdered milk, cornmeal, and soybeans imported from the United States. Teachers who had once taught propaganda lessons about American devils now watched as their pupils cheered the arrival of food trucks. A former student from Osaka remembered decades later, "The milk was sweet. We had never tasted such things. It was strange to think the enemy who destroyed our city now gave us this. It was the beginning of respect." Perhaps most remarkable was the treatment of prisoners of war. Millions of German and Japanese soldiers were still held in American-run camps. By international law, they could have been given only the bare minimum. Instead, the US provided adequate rations, medical care, and even allowed Red Cross packages to be distributed. Many POWs later admitted their shock. In German camps, captured soldiers had been told they would be starved to death. Instead, they found themselves receiving meals with more calories than their families at home. A German prisoner recalled, "I expected revenge. Instead, I gained weight. When I was released, I walked home through the ruins carrying American biscuits. I shared them with children on the road." The decision to feed rather than punish was not without controversy. In Washington, critics argued that America had no obligation to provide for those who had been enemies only months before. In 1946, the US itself faced food shortages, with wheat stocks running low and farmers struggling to meet demand. But appeals from leaders like former President Herbert Hoover, who was appointed as food ambassador, swayed public opinion. Hoover had seen famine in Europe after World War I and warned that repeating the mistake would only breed extremism. "We cannot fight communism with empty stomachs," he declared. His tours of Germany, Japan, and Poland made headlines in American newspapers, galvanizing public support for relief. Ordinary Americans played their part. Churches organized care packages, small boxes of food, soap, and clothing mailed directly to families overseas. For just $15, an American could sponsor a package that included canned meat, powdered milk, coffee, and chocolate. In many German households, these care parcels became treasured lifelines. Families saved the wrappers of American chocolate bars, showing them to children as proof that kindness existed even in a ruined world. The psychological impact was as important as the physical relief. Former enemies began to see the United States not as a conqueror, but as a benefactor. German newspapers, once filled with anti-American caricatures, published editorials praising the generosity of American relief. In Japan, intellectuals who had once denounced Western imperialism began writing essays on the moral responsibility of nations to help one another. Slowly, the seeds of reconciliation were being planted, not by treaties or political speeches, but by loaves of bread and bowls of soup. Even Soviet observers took note. In the eastern occupation zones of Germany, where Soviet policies emphasized retribution and resource extraction, hunger remained acute. Refugees streamed westward, seeking food in the American British and French zones. The contrast was striking. In the West, schools began reopening with American-supplied lunches. In the East, children fainted in classrooms from hunger. This humanitarian divide foreshadowed the larger ideological conflict that would become the Cold War. But in 1946, for millions of ordinary Germans and Japanese, the immediate reality was simple. America was feeding them. The relief did not erase the horrors of war, nor did it undo the suffering inflicted by the defeated regimes. But it offered something both practical and profound, the chance to live, and the hope that former enemies might one day be neighbors, even friends. As the second post-war winter approached, American leaders knew the challenge was far from over. Harvest failures loomed again, and hunger threatened to return with even greater force. By 1947, the world stood at a crossroads. 2 years after the guns had fallen silent, peace remained fragile. Hunger still stalked the ruins of Europe and Asia. In Germany, bread lines stretched through streets lined with rubble. In Japan, families scavenged the charred remains of cities for anything edible. In both nations, the memory of war crimes and devastation lingered like a shadow. Yet, at the same time, something remarkable was beginning to take shape. The realization that the future of peace would not be secured by punishment, but by generosity. The United States, despite its own economic strains, chose to expand relief into something larger, more ambitious than emergency food drops. What began as flour sacks stamped USA turned into a global commitment to rebuild, symbolized by what would later be known as the Marshall Plan. Before the plan was officially launched, the groundwork had already been laid by countless acts of kindness, by soldiers sharing rations, by care packages arriving in bombed-out neighborhoods, by children in American schools holding penny drives to send milk overseas. In Germany, the impact was profound. By the winter of 1947, the calorie ration had risen from 1,000 to 1,500 thanks to American wheat shipments. It was still meager, but it meant survival. More importantly, it meant hope. Families no longer wondered whether their children would wake hungry every morning. They began, tentatively, to dream again. A German boy in Hamburg wrote in his journal, "The Americans gave us milk today. I think maybe the future will not always be war." That boy would grow up to become a teacher, dedicating his life to peace education. Stories like his multiplied across the continent. Japan experienced a similar transformation. American relief ships arriving in Yokohama and Kobe carried not just rice and flour, but also seeds, fertilizer, and machinery to restart agriculture. Farmers who had once cursed American bombers now blessed American tractors that plowed their fields. In Tokyo, a nationwide school lunch program fed millions of children every day with American surplus grain and powdered milk. For many, it was their first introduction to foods like bread, peanut butter, and cocoa. These lunches did more than nourish bodies. They planted an enduring image of America as a country that cared about children, even children of its former enemies. One Japanese teacher remembered her students lining up for their first cup of American milk. They bowed before drinking. It was not just milk, it was a promise that life could continue. Those children, nourished by American generosity, would become Japan's post-war generation of engineers, teachers, and artists who rebuilt their nation into a democracy allied with the United States. The Marshall Plan, formally announced in 1947, extended this generosity on a scale never before imagined. Though it targeted all of Europe, its psychological impact on former enemies was enormous. The United States pledged billions in aid not to exploit, but to rebuild. Factories once blackened by bombs were refitted with American machinery. Railroads carried not troops, but coal and wheat. In Munich, Stuttgart, and Berlin, signs appeared. Don't hate, work. Don't curse, rebuild. For many Germans, these were not hollow slogans, but lived realities made possible by American supplies. The numbers were staggering. Between 1946 and 1952, the US shipped more than 12 million tons of food overseas. That included 3.4 million tons of wheat, 2.3 million tons of corn, and countless tons of milk powder, canned meat, and cooking oil. American farmers worked overtime, harvesting fields not just for their own families, but for children thousands of miles away. One Kansas wheat farmer later recalled, "We loaded rail cars knowing it wasn't for us. It was for kids in places we couldn't even pronounce. But we did it, because our nation asked us, and because it was right." These efforts did more than fill stomachs. They transformed politics. Starving people are desperate people, vulnerable to extremism. Well-fed people can imagine democracy. In West Germany, where American food arrived consistently, support for democratic parties surged. In East Germany, where Soviet policy emphasized extraction rather than relief, shortages deepened resentment. By 1948, the contrast was undeniable. The West associated freedom with bread. The East associated dictatorship with hunger. The Cold War was being shaped not just by weapons, but by wheat. In Japan, the generosity softened cultural divides. During the war, propaganda had portrayed Americans as monsters. Now, those same monsters were sending cocoa and candy bars. A generation of Japanese children grew up associating America not only with bombers, but also with chocolate. That cultural memory, small as it may seem, helped lay the foundation for the friendship that would define post-war US-Japanese relations. A Japanese mother, recalling those years, once said, "The taste of sweet chocolate meant my child would not die. How could we not be grateful?" The relief also had a spiritual dimension. Churches in America sponsored programs to feed former enemies. Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish organizations sent missionaries, not to convert by force, but to provide soup kitchens and schools. This religious humanitarianism echoed across ruined cities, teaching that mercy could follow even the fiercest hatred. In one extraordinary case, German POWs who had been fed fairly in American camps returned home and formed committees urging cooperation with the occupiers. They argued that if America could forgive enough to feed them, then Germans could forgive enough to rebuild together. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy was personal. The men and women who experienced American generosity as children carried it in their hearts for decades. Konrad Adenauer, Germany's first post-war chancellor, often spoke of American bread as the foundation of West Germany's rebirth. In Japan, Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida credited American relief with preventing a collapse into despair. Even ordinary people remembered. One elderly German woman told an interviewer in the 1980s, "I was a girl of 10. My mother stood in line for bread. An American soldier smiled at me and gave me chocolate. That moment changed how I saw the world. I never forgot his kindness." By the early 1950s, the worst of the hunger crisis had passed. Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, its economic miracle, was underway. Japan's factories hummed with new life. Both nations, once bitter enemies, had become economic partners and military allies of the United States. Their gratitude for the food relief of 1945 to 47 was woven into this transformation. It was more than aid. It was proof that America's strength was not only in weapons, but in mercy. Looking back, historians argue that the decision to feed rather than punish was as strategically decisive as any battle. Punishment might have bred bitterness, but bred friendship. The United States demonstrated that true victory does not come from starving your enemies, but from teaching them to stand again. It was a lesson the world desperately needed after a war defined by cruelty. The legacy continues. CARE, the organization that began with packages for Europe's hungry, still operates worldwide today. The Marshall Plan became a model for later aid programs. And in Germany and Japan, the memory of American food relief still endures as a turning point, the moment when survival became possible, when former enemies began to see America not as conqueror, but as partner. The story of America feeding its enemies is, at its heart, a story of vision. It took imagination to see beyond the rubble, to believe that the children of one's enemies might one day become allies. It took courage to send food instead of punishment. And it took generosity, not just of governments, but of farmers, churches, and ordinary citizens, to make it real. For millions who survived, every bowl of soup, every slice of bread, every cup of milk carried a message far greater than calories. It carried the message that even after the most devastating war in history, humanity could choose compassion over vengeance. And in that choice, America not only saved lives, but reshaped the world. Of relief would have to be bigger, more organized, and more visionary. What began as emergency feeding would evolve into one of history's greatest reconstruction efforts, one that would reshape not just Europe and Japan, but the very idea of America in the eyes of the world.